Hi everyone, welcome to this week's Innovate Queensland Grid webinar for giving research and ideas direction. My name is Alexandra Connors from Impact Innovation Group, and we deliver the Innovate Queensland program, which supports the Queensland Government's Advanced Queensland initiative. Today we have Sandy Blackburn-Wright from Social Outcomes as our presenter. Sandy will explain why the size of your enterprise doesn't matter when it comes to including social innovation principles in your business model. She will also highlight how you can create a positive impact while capturing new opportunities to grow and fund your business. Now, just while we are waiting for people to connect into the webinar, I'll just run through a couple of our tools we'll be using today. So, your screen should look like this, a slide in the center and a control panel or dashboard on your right. This control panel will collapse automatically when you're not using it. So to keep it open, click the View menu up the top and uncheck Auto Hide Control Panel. Now, during the webinar, we might ask you a question so we better understand your experience with the topic. We'll ask you to raise your hand, and to do that, just click this little hand icon on the control panel. Now, to remember to lower your hand afterwards by just clicking on the icon again. So I'll just do a quick test to see if everyone can hear me clearly. If you can, if you wouldn't mind clicking on the hand icon. Fantastic, thank you everyone. Okay, so there's also an opportunity for you to ask questions. So the webinar can flow smoothly and we stick to the time allocated. We'd prefer to answer the questions at the end, but you can send us your questions when they occur to you. You can also use this function to let us know if you're having any problems with the broadcast. All right, now we also have some handouts for you, which you can access and download by clicking on this section here. These handouts will not be available to download after the webinar, so I'll remind you all again after the completion of the presentation. Okay, now in a moment, I'm going to hand the screen over to Sandy. Sandy spent 15 years working in South Africa pre and post apartheid, working on transformational change. She worked in such areas as community and leadership development, education, domestic energy, gender and enterprise development. Since returning to Australia in 2003, she spent 10 years in corporate Australia working at PwC and Westpac, including such roles as Head of Learning and Culture and Head of Social Innovation. Since leaving Westpac, she co-founded Impact Investing Australia, a not-for-profit designed to grow the impact investment market here in Australia, and then founded Social Outcomes, a for-purpose enterprise that focuses on social and financial innovation to increase the impact that organisations can deliver. Sandy serves on the Australian Advisory Board for the Global Steering Group on Impact Investing, the Advisory Board of QUT's Centre for Not-for-Profit and Philanthropic Studies, and is a Fellow at Griffith University Centre for Sustainable Enterprise. Okay, so I'll just switch the screen over to you, Sandy.
Thanks, Ali. Can everyone see that screen?
It's just popping up now.
Great. I can see a few hands going up, so I'm assuming that's yes. All right, so what I thought we might do is start with two things. One is a definition and the second is a story. So firstly, in terms of the definition, what is social innovation? I very much like Dr. Ingrid Burkett's definition, that it's the design and implementation of better ways to harness assets and meet needs for the benefit of people and planet. So it's innovation for a purpose. So it could be social, it could be cultural, it could be environmental, but it's using all of the assets at our disposal with a specific intent. So it's not about innovation for financial reward, although you want a financial reward, but you don't only want a financial reward, but you're looking for the benefit of people and planet. And then I just wanted to tell you,
sorry to interrupt, I think your slides haven't just fully come up yet. It's still saying that we're waiting for them to pop up.
Right.
I might just try.
How was that?
Yes, perfect. We can see you now. Thank you.
I've just re-hit show screen. All right, so there's the definition for you, which of course you'll have in the handouts. So it's about the intentionality. So it's the same way in which you'd innovate businesses in other contexts, but it's about the intention of the outcome that you're seeking to create, which is financial and social, cultural, environmental. Then I wanted to start with a story. So I'm sure no one's heard of Edward Smith Hall unless you've heard me speak about this before. But about 7 years ago, when we were doing the social impact bond with the Benevolent Society, and I was still with Westpac as head of social innovation, it was the Benevolent Society's 200th birthday celebrations. And I was at a meeting and we realised that the Benevolent Society had been established by a young man called Edward Smith Hall, who in fact was the same man a few years later that went on to found what is now Westpac. And I find this story so interesting because if you read up on Edward Smith Hall at all, he's an unusual character. He's one of those mavericks that has real strengths and real weaknesses. So all sorts of ghosts in his past. But such an interesting story because he was a young man who had ambitions in a very broad sense. And he came to Australia when the colony was just getting established. And he was looking at what foundations does a nation have? So we're building this new thing from scratch, and what do we need? So he was very concerned about the plight of orphans and widows, and so he set up the Benevolent Society with a few friends. Now his father was a banker, and so he understood the need for banking. So he went on to again establish Westpac, understanding that that would be really important in a budding colony for people to be able to save and borrow and so on. Funnily enough, though, he only did it for 2 or 3 years because one of the stipulations the Board of Trustees put on him as also the first employee of Westpac was that he had to sleep in the bank and he wasn't allowed to be out and about after 10 o'clock at night because they wanted a level of propriety in their employees. So after a couple of years, I think he was missing his family. So he went on to go and do other things. 2 other things of note. One is to set up a free press in Australia, and another one was to look at the concept of a jury, but a jury of your peers, as opposed to courts making decisions just around the judge's opinion only. So he was incredibly influential in shaping what was to become Australia. But the reason I like this story so much is he didn't seem to differentiate about all the things we need in society. And today we often think that business is just business and social is just social. But the people who put the foundations of our nation together really didn't make that decision, is that our society needs a range of different things to make it work well. And business and charities are part of that same continuum. So I always like to talk about these issues in that context and understanding how they were designed from the get-go. So bear with me on that, but an interesting read about Edward Smith Hall. So if we're thinking about what the opportunities are, so if you're starting up a business or you're thinking about growing your business, you're always looking for new markets. But what we're often seeing today when we're doing innovation is we seem to be looking for small niches and then trying to dominate that niche. But there's an opportunity when we think about social innovation and innovating for social outcomes that is much, much broader than that because it's largely untapped. So rather than finding a small niche in an existed crowded market through some kind of technology play and the like, there's an opportunity to take on a whole new market. And sometimes one of the things that worries me about the way we build businesses these days is creating needs where they don't exist. And I think that there are massive needs to be met socially, culturally, environmentally. We don't have to manufacture them, they exist. And these new markets are often in underserved communities or social issues that are emerging that affect us all, that are quite broad, and there's an opportunity to innovate around what we could offer into that emerging social issue. And what we're also seeing now is new kinds of partnerships. It used to be, as I've just described, that we've thought about charities meeting a certain need and businesses meeting another need. But we're almost coming full circle back to those original foundations of the country and saying we can partner between business and charities and other entities and government for that matter, using technology, using collaboration and other ideas and innovation to actually address the issues that we're seeing. So we're seeing new financial instruments for that, but we're also seeing new businesses being established, and we're seeing business used as a tool for creating positive social impact. And as I said, this creates whole new markets. So the spend, for example, in Australia, last time I checked, and it could be more than this now, was $43 billion on dealing with the social issues that we're seeing in Australia every year. So if we can come up with solutions that feed into that, it's quite a large market that we could be tapping. So I think we need both our social hats on, our sort of members of community and society hat on, but also our business hats on, because we're not going to solve these problems by continually looking for charitable solutions. There just isn't enough money to do that. So we've got to think creatively and innovatively. And I think those partnerships between social outcomes, technology, and business models are really the way to go. And we're certainly starting to see that around the world. So just to give you a flavour for some of the examples we're seeing in the breadth of opportunities that are being captured in the market. So that toilet is a photo that I took when I was visiting a sanitation enterprise in Fiji. But it's one of many around the world, many sanitation enterprises, where we absolutely need water and sanitation solutions. But what we're seeing now is more than aid and development. We're starting to see enterprise solutions where people either pay to use a community toilet that's well maintained, it's clean and hygienic, and the waste is managed responsibly, or we're seeing people who aren't seeing the delivery of those sanitation services being willing to save up and buy their own toilet. And so what you're seeing there is a demonstration park of 3 different models that people in informal settlements could buy in Fiji. So we've got about 3 or 4 social enterprises that have set up in Fiji under a single banner, but there's a different enterprise in different parts of the country, but they're all doing it in the same approach of the local community groups setting up a sanitation enterprise with profits from the sale of those toilets to community members being reinvested into better health and hygiene outcomes for each given community. So we're seeing that in countries all around the world now where sanitation needs aren't being met, enterprise solutions are popping up. So there's business in toilets, which is really interesting and possibly not something we thought of 10 or 20 years ago. So we're seeing something as simple and basic as that being rolled out across developing countries. We're also seeing things like this M-call, so the photo of all the watches there. I don't know if people have kept up to date with this, but the opportunities for supporting people with dementia and other forms of disability are growing. And M-call is just one example of many, where you can put a watch on an aging parent, and not only can you on your phone track where they are, but they can also put an SOS call straight to you, so they don't have to worry and dial your number, but they can just press a button and get straight through to you. You can also call them in the same way and not having to worry about a phone. But it means that it's a technological solution to a social problem, but it has an underlying business model where I had a father who had dementia, and had this product been available when he was alive, it's something that I absolutely would have invested in and bought one for him, because we were concerned he liked to do a daily walk, but as he got worse, it was a real issue that he might wander off and not find his way home. But it's essentially a social issue, so it's a health and well-being, welfare issue, but it's being solved and addressed through a business model. So really exciting technology that you're seeing like that, and for a multitude of other social issues. Then you've also got M-Pesa, which is a mobile banking enterprise that is operating through a range of developing countries, but really cut its teeth in Africa. And this is such an interesting story, because what we had was a latecomer to the offering of banking, essentially in countries particularly in East Africa, where it got its start. And the problem that they were experiencing was the remittances. So a lot of African countries are based off a remittance culture, in the same way that we're seeing in the Pacific, where people have to send money home to support people who are living the family home in rural areas. But you can use services that are very expensive to get it there. And what we saw with that technology is it completely leapt over the top of existing offerings and bypassed a step in banking and went straight to mobile banking. So it didn't look to establish branches in more remote areas so that money could be moved around and so on and so on. It just went straight into the mobile banking world. So people are now moving around money on their mobile phones in a range of countries across Africa and South America through this platform that M-Pesa built. So it's dealing with an issue that's very pressing for people around how do you make sure that people in the home base have enough money to live based on people's salaries in the city, and how can you move it around in a secure way that doesn't have massive costs to the family when money is really tight. So a fantastic social enterprise where they're looking for those social outcomes as well as running that as a business so it can expand and grow and offer that services to more and more people. So you're seeing those kind of essentially really simple fintech being offered at scale. And so they're continuing to grow at quite a speed. And then you've got the entities like Thank You, which I'm assuming many of you would have heard of, but it started out some years ago as a small little Australian social enterprise where they were doing something called Thank You Water. And so they saw that there was a market in bottled water, and they said, well, if rather people didn't buy bottled water, but if they were going to buy bottled water, why don't they buy our water and we will give all of our profits to water projects. So water and sanitation projects, a little bit like the ones we're trying to get up in Fiji. So how can we take the sale of a product and turn it into funding for projects that are really needed in our region? So they started off with a water product, and they very quickly expanded to a wide range of fast-moving consumer goods that now have penetration into Coles and Woolies, and everywhere you go, there's Thank You products. So they've linked the impact to the nature of the product. So they've got hygiene products, so they've got soaps and hand washes and sanitizers and things like that, and they go into hygiene projects. They've got a muesli and a muesli bar and that kind of range, and that goes into feeding programs and so on. And the way that they've done it is very engaging for each of us as consumers, because you can actually get a code on every product you buy, and you can track to see where your money's going. And they have partnered with numerous charities and NGOs around the world, and you can track to see what they're doing in what countries, what impact they're having. So they've negotiated a really nice relationship for the consumer to be able to track and see the impact that their purchases have had. So very transparent, very clever, and basically it's the kind of model where you make as much money as you can, and therefore you give all that money away, and the more you sell, the more you give away. So I've picked those four as kind of a range of all the kind of enterprises that we're seeing, but there are hundreds of thousands in between, everything you could possibly think of. We're starting to see social enterprise grow and expand, and that's being underpinned by the global impact investment movement, which allows you to attract investors to a business that you might have trouble getting from classic sources. So the banks mightn't want to touch you yet. Venture capital is too tricky to get, but if you can find an impact investor, and there are more and more of them now, who's interested not only in the financials of your business, but also the social, cultural, or environmental impact that you're creating, is willing to invest in you. And what you can do with impact investing also is to blend the kind of investment that you're getting. So you might have someone that's an institutional investor and they need a reasonable return for the risk that they're taking, but you could blend that with a philanthropic investor who can take a lesser return. And that will allow you to drop your overall return. So we're seeing impact investing growing exponentially globally in order to fund activities like these. So there's also an opportunity to retain market share. So for existing companies or new companies looking to challenge existing market share holders, we're seeing issues that and new dynamics that are driving the kind of social innovation I've been talking about. So as you would be well aware of, greater calls for transparency, consumers requiring ethically produced goods and services, and changes in supply chain management. So what's happening when we have a greater level of transparency is that people are beginning to ask questions about how goods and services are made and produced. So the fires, for example, in Bangladesh a few years ago have really led to a movement for ethical fashion. And so as people, as consumers, we're now starting to ask questions about the $2 and $5 t-shirt. We want to know, is there slave labor used? Are people safe when they're making these products, or are they working in conditions which are underpaid and not physically safe for them. So not only for the entity that we're buying from, but also every supplier that sits in their supply chain, we're asking questions about that supply chain. So we're seeing new brands coming up like Atico that are very much focused around ethically produced fashion, but we're also seeing companies like Thread Harvest where you can go and they will vet for you that these goods are ethically and socially compliant in their production. And so you can shop off a website like Thread Harvest, knowing that that vetting has already been done and you don't have to try and dig into that the brand to see what it is they're doing. Other things also happened, you know, in terms of Apple and Nike that were pushing people in that direction and all of those high-profile cases. We've also seen things like Danone, and so they were responding to some of those challenges as well, but they also weren't just doing it from a defensive position saying we've got to get our house in order. They were also saying how can we think about using what we do to create social benefit. So Danone started out looking at their yogurt production and how can they think about the way that they produce their yogurt and distribute it to make sure that they're employing people from a disadvantaged background. So they've started to build that into their business model with tremendous success. And they've been using a lot of the product also to feed into feeding schemes in Indian schools. So they've had that double benefit. You'd all be familiar with the fair trade movement. So fair trade coffee and chocolate, all those kind of things. So people having to get certification for how they do things. So that's another big part of it. I don't know if you can see my toolbar, but it's on my screen is hiding Ben & Jerry's. And Ben & Jerry's make ice cream and they want to make ice cream, you know, out of a good supply chain, but they're also using their brand to challenge the way some things are done. And so that's been an interesting change as well. And they're finding greater customer loyalty because they're putting their values first and saying this is who we are, what we stand for, and attracting new customers in what is a very crowded market. I don't know if you've heard of an Australian carpet company called Interface and their subsidiary called Networks, but it's such a fantastic story. So they produce most of the carpets that people would be sitting on in offices around the country today, and they introduced the innovation around the carpet tile. And the reason they did that is they were looking for sustainable outcomes in their business. So rather than if there was a stain in an office ripping up the whole office, they could just replace the tile so that they felt that that was more sustainable. So they thought that was a great start, but what else could they do? And they began looking back into their supply chain and saying, where are we sourcing our raw materials from and how can that be done more sustainably? So one of the projects that they sponsored was piloted in the Philippines, and they saw the problems with old fishing nets were clogging up the fisheries around the island. And the fishing industry was dying because of all the pollution from these damaged nets that were just sort of washing up onto the shore and tangling the fish and other sea creatures. So what they did is say, let's create a business where people who perhaps used to fish now go and fish for damaged nets and bring them in, clean them up, and we will buy them off them. We will recycle them in one of our other members of the supply chain. I think they're based in the Netherlands, and turn that into the raw material that we make our carpet out of. So those carpet tiles now are starting to be made from reclaimed fishing nets. And in the first couple of years of that Philippines pilot alone, they created enough recycled fishing nets to circumnavigate the earth. So, which is quite terrifying when you think of it like that, but also a fantastic opportunity. So they're now expanding that, and they're expanding it into the east coast of Africa so that they can do the same kind of reclaiming of fishing nets. So what they're seeing in the Philippines is it's reopening the opportunity to fish because the fish aren't being killed by these nets, but it's also opened up a new industry, not only to go and collect the nets, but also to clean them up. And you've seen whole communities that are involved in this process of fishing for nets, but also cleaning the nets and then selling them onto networks and then into the Interface supply chain. But also a general cleanup in the community, because the community was really concerned about the plastic and everything that was washing up on their beaches and not a safe place for their children to play. But now that they're creating a market for that waste product, they're starting to think more broadly about what else can they clean up, what else can they recycle, and so on. So the areas where they've piloted that in the Philippines have really seen a turnaround in how the environment's being managed locally as well. So incredibly exciting project there, and very proud that it's an Australian company. And then just to flag that we're starting to see ethical banking products as well, despite the banking commission that's going on. We've got super funds like Australian Ethical Super, Christian Super, Future Super, who are all looking at impact investing and ethical products. And broadly, we're seeing super funds offering a range of ethical products, both as superannuation funds and also as investment funds. And then we're starting to see, as I mentioned before, impact investing opportunities, social impact bonds in Australia. I think we're sitting at about 12 now that people can invest in. It hasn't, beyond these kind of super funds, got to the point where we can invest in retail type impact investments, but that will come. So all of these things are changing. So whether you're large or small, there's an opportunity to grab new markets, but also to retain what market share you have by transforming the way that you do business and engaging in social innovation and environmental cultural innovation through your business to make it more future-proof. So these are all really exciting developments and ones that can actually make your business stronger. If this is of interest to you, what I thought might be useful is just to map out the three kinds of social enterprises that you see in Australia. So one of these three might not fit the business that you're building or considering or already have in existence, but I think it helps to clarify the thinking around how you could engage and how you could integrate social innovation into your business model. So we've got these three buckets that we all talk about in the social enterprise sector here in Australia. So the first bucket is employing people from a disadvantaged background. So those were the early cafes that you saw getting set up around the place, where people who were long-term unemployed or youth at risk would be employed in a cafe and they'd learn those skills and you could buy your coffee there. We went on to today, recently having been set up in Toowoomba, the Vanguard Laundry, where they're employing people in a highly efficiently and professionally run laundry that's servicing corporate and government clients. But it's employing, last time I looked, about 36 people from a lived mental health background who are really struggling to get into the workplace or back into the workplace. So we're seeing those kind of models. And with that kind of model, you're making decisions all the time about what's in the best interest of my workforce, because that's where my social impact is being created. So how can I create a workplace that's very sensitive to people's needs, that is flexible enough to work with people with, say, a mental health background, or a migrant background, that we're cognizant of language issues and so on, and additional training budgets will be spent in that kind of model. So that's probably the most common model that you see in Australia, and one that can take on grant funding and is often set up as a company limited by guarantee. Some are profitable in their own right. Others are not profitable without a little bit of philanthropy, but the philanthropy isn't used to run the business model. The philanthropy is essentially used to support the employees. So the business itself is often, functioning and profitable. But that's the kind of thing that we're seeing. So you need strong social outcomes and strong business model to be put together. What we learned from that business model is if 100% of your employees come from a disadvantaged background, it overburdens the enterprise. So you do need to blend your workforce with some people from an average work background and others from a disadvantaged background. Learning from each other is the best combination for that kind of model, and then it can work quite well. The second model is where you provide a service to a disadvantaged or underserved group. Now, the watch that I showed you would fit into that, but also something like a travel agency that was catering only for people with a disability. Because I understand, having looked at that now, that it's really difficult if you have a disability to use a normal travel agent, because there's all these things to consider. And so people, if you have a need for a wheelchair, for example, there's so many things that need to be thought of. And so to have a travel agency that specialises in that and can think of all the things ahead of time and make that experience really smooth end to end is an incredible support to people with disabilities. So as I understand it, there are one or two such travel agencies out there now, but you're running a business as you normally would, but the business is targeted towards people who may have a health issue or whatever it might be. So you might also target, say, the migrant community, and how can you provide a business that's going to service them as they integrate and those kind of things. But in this model, your end users have to be able to afford your service. Whereas in bucket one, your end users, your beneficiaries of your social intent, are employees inside the organisation. So then being able to afford what you offer is not an issue because they're not paying for that, you're paying them. But in bucket 2, you have to pick a group that can afford or has someone that can afford under, say, the NDIS model, can afford to pay for those services. So some people have shown me models where they're thinking about this, but the beneficiaries that they're considering still can't afford to pay for the service that they're offering, and so it doesn't stack up as a business model. So you certainly have to find your way to do fee for service in that model. The third bucket that we talk about in Australia is where you run a business like Thank You, where everything that you're doing is to maximise profits. You'll also want to consider that last slide we were looking about transparency in your supply chain and the accountability for being ethically produced. However, you're looking to grow the business in order to grow your profit base. So that's how you reach your social or environmental impact through the money that you give away. So when I would look at models like this for philanthropy or for investment, I'd be looking primarily at the business model to see if it's really well stacked. So if this, for example, was a cafe, I wouldn't love it as a business model because the profits that you can make in a cafe model are so slim and there's high competition, et cetera, and they often fail, so not a great one. So you've got to choose a business where you know it's really profitable. You have a unique selling point around your profits going to certain issues, but you've still got to deliver a quality product in an accessible way that is well made and has a transparent supply chain in order to capture today's market share and then grow it from there. So the story that, say, Thank You have around what they're doing is really compelling, but the products are fantastic as well, and I can buy them easily. And the same would be true for Who Gives a Crap, which do paper products, so toilet paper, paper towels, tissues, and so on. I've got one of them on my desk. So those kind of models where they give away the profits have to be a really strong business. And so that may be something that you think about. So if you get to that point and you have a sense of where you would like to focus your business and your impact, there are 3 steps that I would suggest that you go through in order to prepare to do that. And the first step is the why. So why are you doing this? What's your intention? So why are you pursuing a social or environmental outcome through your business? And some people would say, well, I'd like to give money to cancer because my mother had cancer and so on. So that's one reason, but I think it's really clear. It's really important to be clear about it and to articulate it because it's not just you often in that business, but how are you inspiring other people in your business to get behind that social purpose? Do they have a connection to it? I don't know if people are aware of, I'm having a blank on the name of the company, but it's Alan English runs the company and it leases out catering products. And the way that Alan has built that business to be one of Australia's fastest growing businesses is got everyone excited about the social purpose of that business, Silver Chef. So what Silver Chef does, it's really clear when you walk into their offices, you see it everywhere on the walls, people talk about it, is their social outcome is created through their business success. So their model 3, bucket 3. But what they explain to staff is when we do well, we will invest money in Opportunity International, who do microfinance. So the better we do, the more we can lend to small businesses in developing countries around the world. And then Opportunity International engages with Silver Chef so that people can understand the impact that they're making through the work that they're doing. But the staff of Silver Chef are incredibly clear about what a strong business performance means. They are very connected to Opportunity International, and people work hard in order to get those outcomes, not just for themselves and their own career progression, but also so that they can give more away to Opportunity International. So being clear about why you're doing it and communicating that to your teams are really important, but also to your customers and your supply chain. It's really important. So spend some time thinking about why it matters to you, what the issue is and why it matters to you. The second one is a trickier question. Are you willing to make decisions in favour of that outcome if forced to choose between that and a better financial outcome? Now, particularly if you're going for bucket 2 or bucket 1, it's of utmost importance. But sometimes there will come a moment when you have to choose. And so you might say, well, going back to the supply chain issue, if we buy from this producer, we're going to get a cheaper product. But what we're trying to deal with, say, is slave labour is our thing, and we're a bit concerned about their labour practices in Bangladesh or whatever it might be. Do you choose to go with them because it's going to be cheaper for you and therefore better for your bottom line? Or do you say, no, that's not what we're going to do because it kind of runs counter to the outcome that we're trying to achieve? There will always be those moments, and that's why that first step is so important as to why you're doing this. What's the issue that you're trying to contribute to through your business, such that when it comes to those moments, both you and your board and your exec team, your staff and so on, can all agree this is how we're going to make these decisions when it comes to those difficult moments. So having those discussions up front as part of your onboarding, something you discuss regularly through your board and so on, is incredibly important, so that you're not taken off guard when those come. And if you do choose a financial outcome, that may be fine, but just know under what conditions and what criteria that you would use to make that decision. So having that kind of decision framework in place ahead of time is really important. And once you've clarified what it is you're wanting to achieve, how you're going to make decisions around that, build that commitment into your governance structure and your governing documents. Because you might be very committed to this, your board might be committed to this, and then you get bought out by another company, which would be really exciting for you. But does that new company, is it aligned to the values that you've set up and the way that you've created your business success through that values alignment? Is it something that the new entity is on board with, or new people coming onto your board, or new staff joining your company? So building it into your governance structure and governance documents locks that mission in, if that's what's important to you. The second step is design, so the how. And so this is often an overlooked part of the work. So people will say, I want to help find a cure for cancer, so we're going to give 5% of our profits to cancer research perhaps, but they don't think about how that change is going to be created. So the theory of change is really simple. If I do this, then that happens. And whatever that theory is. So if you're going to do the change work yourself, you have to be clear on what it is that you're doing is creating this change. If I employ people from a disadvantaged background, it will change their lives in the following way. If I provide a service to an underserved community, it's going to change their lives in the following way. Often when we get caught up in these things, we're thinking more about ourselves and our own activity and less about the beneficiaries of the outcome that we're trying to create. And if we can't see a change for the better in their lives, then it's not working. So you have to ask yourself, is there an evidence base for this theory that I have? So if I put money into a cancer research organisation, how do I know that that's going to create better cancer treatments? So then you'd start asking questions of that entity that you're going to invest into, as how they strategically invest the money that you're putting forward, and you'd interrogate their theory of change. Also, you've got to ask yourself, is what I'm proposing the most simple and effective way to achieve the change that I'm looking for? Sometimes we say in that bucket 3, I'm going to run a company that makes lots of money, I'm going to give that money away. When maybe the money that you actually have as profit is negligible and you've done all this work to get there and you're only giving away $10,000 a year, and you could have done that with a charity dinner or not, but you know what I mean? It's a lot of work to get to where you're wanting to go, so you have to ask yourself the question, given my theory of change, is this the simplest and most effective way to achieve that change, or should I be thinking of another model? The next piece is, what assets do you have to work with? So what are my strengths and how do I play to those strengths? So there's a company called Adhara, and they were set up because it's a financial services company, and the woman, Odette Excel, who set it up, said, well, I'm good at things in the financial world. That's where my skill sets lie. And I'm seeing all sorts of people running NGOs, and they're spending all their time fundraising and not enough time focusing in on the real work that matters for them. So what she decided to do was to run her financial services business, and then set up an Adhara Foundation that would then free people up to do the work that was important with the capital that she was raising. But she was using her core skill set to do that, and she's been incredibly successful in getting that done. And the reason she is she understood what assets she had to work with, and she leveraged off those really effectively. So you can also ask yourself, who could you partner with? Now, my moment when there's some tragedy where I always cringe just a little is bad things happen, and then the next thing that people do is to set up a new foundation to remember the person who died or whatever it might be. And I understand the intention around that, but I think the question we should always be asking in those moments is, who could I partner with? Because it's expensive to set up something new foundation, a new business, whatever it might be. And often partnering can be a better way to get that done. And so who out there is doing the same kind of work that I'm doing around whatever issue I'm interested in, environmental or social? And could I partner with them in order to achieve those outcomes? Is a challenging but incredibly important question. So if you skip this design phase, I think you actually will only have a fraction of the impact that you could potentially have. So incredibly important. So now you've worked out all of this and you're starting to trade and things are moving along, you certainly then want to set yourself measurement and feedback goals. So set an attainable target for what you want to achieve. Don't make it too big. I'm going to end world hunger. I'm going to reduce poverty by 50%, because no one will believe you, for starters, but also it's way too big. So attaining small, plausible targets will actually be more rewarding for you and your team and your customers and so on than going for something that's massive and never getting there. So put a ring fence around the number of people, the geography, the time frame, and set yourselves achievable targets. And you can reset another target down the line, but be really focused and clear about what you're going to do, and then measure to see whether you're achieving that. Just a simple framework as to what that might look like. The temptation is to make that really complex. You don't have time, you're running a business. Something really simple that you can report back to your team, to your board, shareholders, customers, stakeholders, and so on, to say this is what we're doing. And then these impact measurement frameworks should also test your theory of change, because if your theory of change is weak, you want to know about it and you want to make adjustments and gain insights and change that so that you're increasing your impact. So it's incredibly important to build that into your impact measurement framework. And once you've done that, you've got a good foundation to be creating both business success and social and environmental impact. So I might leave it there and go to questions.
Great, thank you so much, Sandy. Your presentation was extremely valuable. I think a lot of the information we need to take away to digest and think about how we can apply it for our businesses. We do have a couple of questions. So first question to start off with is, how do I know which type of enterprise to choose? Should I build in the impact or give a portion of my profits to a cause?
I think that one, it's partly a personal decision as to what kind of business you want to run. I'm just checking though, Ali, is my webcam on?
No, it hasn't come up just yet, and your slides are out of presenter mode.
Yep, I just took them out so I could share the webcam. Yep. Let's just see if it comes on.
Yep, all good.
Okay, so it depends what kind of business you want to run. If you want to run a business that's primarily social in nature and the business model is a way to get you there, then running the kind of bucket 1 or 2 is the way to go, where it's high impact. And the financials, all you really want is just to break even. You want to wash your face. You want to be able to grow that business, but you don't need to make, hundreds of thousands of dollars in profit. That's not why you're there. You're there to create impact. So all of the potential and the extra time you have is going into improving the impact. Whereas if you'd really like to run a business that has social outcomes as one of the benefits of that, and you've got a business that you think could be really profitable, then doing sort of the bucket 3 type, where you might give some money away, that could be a great way to do that. But the caveat around that is, I would say, choose your partners very carefully. Don't just give money to the big brands, the big not-for-profit brands that you know, but be really picky around who you partner with, who you give the money to. Make sure that there's a good values alignment, that they are really clear and you are really clear on what your what the theory of change is around that, and ask them for regular feedback as to how that's going. And if they're really not delivering the impact with your hard-earned profits, then find another partner. But be picky and be demanding of the impact that you're looking to create through that avenue.
Sure, thank you. Ben would like to know, can you recommend any sources of ethical investors?
We've got a large network of ethical and impact investors. and they want different things at different times. So sometimes they might be interested in, because they're running portfolios like any investor is. So in their portfolio, they might have some equity and some debt that are exiting at different times, and they're wanting to make sure they've got a balance between the two. They might have an impact investment that's looking at health, but they'd like to see something that is doing aging as well, and they'd like to bring that in their portfolio. But once that's in, they're not looking for aging anymore. So it varies as to what they want, when, in what format, and so on. But there are certainly lots of impact investors out there. You've got your philanthropic investors who are doing philanthropy still, but they're using their corpus to invest in impact investments in addition to that, and they're willing to take a slightly lower return. And then you've got your institutional investors. So for example, QBE have set up a social impact bond fund, and our last social impact bond that we did here in Queensland, they invested in that. So they've got $100 million to spend on social impact bonds all around the world, and every bond that comes up, they have a look and see if they want to take a piece of that. So that's quite a dedicated fund. And there's everything in between. But there's a lot of work to be done around investment readiness for impact investors to make sure that your business model is strong, that your business performance is strong, but also that your impact is really clear and articulate and well measured.
Thank you. So Helen would like to know, if you have started your social enterprise, how can you determine what your theory of change is so you can improve it to increase your impact?
It's just asking yourself, how do I create positive outcomes? So let's say you've got your social enterprise and you're employing people from a disadvantaged background. What's changing in their lives is always the question. Are things better for this group of people than before they worked here? And so if it's a social enterprise that employs people, what I've seen is it's around creating a really supportive workplace where people's limits and aspirations are well understood. So you can support people when they need support, but stretch people when they need stretch and give them new experiences. The funny thing for me about social enterprises is the way that we set them up with such a strong consideration of a good workplace. It's kind of the workplace that everyone wants to work in. And I certainly don't think that they are transitional, that people should be thinking, I'll just do a little bit of time in a social enterprise and that will get me into mainstream employment. I think social enterprises are a destination because there's often a big focus on making a really supportive workplace where there's good work being done, but in a context that's respectful of what people's strengths and weaknesses are. But it's asking yourself that basic question, how am I creating impact? So what impact am I trying to create? How am I creating it? And is it working? And asking people who are your beneficiaries, are things better because of what we're doing together? And it's not, are you happier? That's the main thing, because that's, you know, on any given day, I'm happy or not, depending on how I slept, basically. But what's changed in my life? Can I put more food on the table? Do I have a regular routine in my life that means that I am socializing now where I wasn't before? I've got friends I didn't have before. I'm learning new things. I'm able to create my own income. I'm able to have independence if I have a disability. All of those kind of things. What's changing in the lives of the people that you're serving, and how can you tell? And if it's not, the answer to that is it's not what you thought it was, then go to the evidence base and have a little read around the research on that issue that you're interested in and see what other organisations are doing what and learn from them.
Definitely. Yasmin would like to know, if you have a model that's creating revenue and impact, how do you go about reaching out to the right impact investment?
That's a really good question. So as I alluded to before, some impact investors are what you'd call financial first. So particularly the institutional investors, like say a super fund, it has to be delivering a certain level of return. And so it's got a risk profile that reflects that. Whereas when you're talking to a philanthropic investor, so they're coming from a foundation, you're probably going to find more values alignment, but getting to them can be harder because not everyone talks about what they're doing, because philanthropy in Australia is a little bit shy. But if you're looking for someone that's going to invest in your business because it's a good financial proposition and on top of that they get impact, then your institutional type, your business investor is the one you're going for. If the returns aren't as fabulous, but the impact is much stronger than the previous organisation I just mentioned, then look to philanthropists who are impact investors and look for values alignment. So it just depends what you want out of the investment, because they will partner with you. They may sit on your board and all those things, and values alignment is everything. So whether they're finance first or impact first, for me, is incredibly important when helping to manage that fit.
Another question. You mentioned that one of the key aspects of social enterprises is fundraising. Do you have any advice to new social enterprises in how to incorporate this in their business model, particularly with any new innovation and platforms occurring in this space?
So what we're seeing these days is that the way businesses get set up is with family and friends putting in that first bit of risk capital, that angel funding. The same is true for social enterprises. Family and friends, the person themselves, being willing to go without a salary, say, for the first little while. It's incredibly important to get some runs on the board. So when I was at Westpac, I did a lot, and still do, with the Westpac Foundation, the Westpac Bicentennial Foundation. So the Westpac Foundation does significant, and always has significant, funding for social enterprises, but they will only fund bucket 1, and they will also only fund social enterprises that have some skin in the game. So they've been up and running for about a year. What we see some social enterprises do is they don't want to start trading until they've got an investor. So whether it's a grant or an investor, and that can be really challenging, because both a grant maker and an investor is going to want to see some runs on the board, some skin in the game. So whether it's friends or family, or these days you're also seeing crowdfunding. And so can you crowdfund from your future client base an amount of money to get you up and trading? And then once you're trading, think more about the customer than you do about the funder, because they will help give you the revenue streams you're looking for. I hope that helps. It's a tricky one, and there are various ways to go, but I would say family and friends, crowdfunding, and then looking at the foundations like the Westpac Foundation and others who fund social enterprises, but only once they're up and running.
Thank you. Next question. How do I choose a charity to support if I'm going to share my profits?
As I said, very, very carefully. So we often get seduced by names we know, like brands, in the same way we do when we buy clothes. But just because you're a big brand doesn't mean you're impactful. And so we're seeing a movement in the not-for-profit space also towards outcomes. And that's beginning to push people to ask those questions of themselves and start to communicate how their impact is being created and delivered. So if I was going to approach a charity, you might start with someone that you've heard of, but the first question I would ask is, what's your theory of change? Do you have an impact measurement framework in place, and can I see some of your data? Can I see some results of that impact measurement that you've been doing? So ask questions, don't be seduced by the brand. If you don't like the questions, the answers to the questions you're getting, go and look somewhere else. The ACNC has a website, and you can check out any charity, any registered charity on their website, the regulator for the sector. So that's one way to go. Have a look at their annual reports, but always thinking about impact. Now, if you're into innovation, which I am, I'm also looking for innovation. So how are they innovating in what they do? Is it evidence-based? Are they pushing the boundaries? Are they thinking about new ways of creating impact? But if they're only talking about activity and the work that they do, not about the impact that they're creating for beneficiaries, they're not the right partner.
Sure, thank you. So Leanne has a question around how important is her story. So she's interested in what she's doing and sees value, but it's not driven by a personal story or connection to the cause. Yep. So how does she use her story to enhance the business?
I get a little sick of people telling me how passionate they are, because every pitch I get, that's what people will lead with. And whilst you want people to be excited about their business, excited about the impact they're creating, those kind of things, just telling me you're passionate doesn't cut the cheese with me. It doesn't mean anything. You hear it so often. Whereas if you're articulate about how the thing that you're going to do is creating change, you understand that theory of change, you understand how change is created, how you're going to enact that, how you're going to grow your business and so on, if you can tell a story about why the issue is important, for me, that's much more meaningful, because I want to see someone who has a strong business model, who understands the issue that they're trying to drive through that business model and can articulate it really well. The story doesn't have to be yours as the entrepreneur. And often there's a risk. We've seen this a lot in social enterprises in the last decade or so in Australia, and it's our fault as, you know, I don't know what to call this, but the supporters of the sector and the growers of the sector, is we've tended to idealize the social entrepreneur too much. And often they've been young people. And so what we've done as supporters and mentors and so on is put these young people up on pedestals, and it becomes a personality cult. And these poor young people find it very hard to move on to the next thing because they're kind of stuck on the pedestal. So I think that there's a shift now to moving away from the entrepreneur and the founder story, and more telling stories about the impact, telling stories about the business and how they interrelate. So I wouldn't be too worried about it, and it certainly would win brownie points with me if you didn't talk about it at all.
Perfect, thank you. Stuart has a question. So in your talk, you mentioned a financial partner that had set up a foundation. Can you clarify the name of that foundation?
Do you mean QBE?
It sounded like something like Adhara.
Oh, Adhara. So Adhara Financial Services, they have the Adhara Foundation, and they're focused on Nepal and Uganda, and they do maternal and neonatal health in Uganda. They have a hospital there, and they do human trafficking in Nepal. So they chose two very underfunded and country bound, so they don't have a port, and so their economies are struggling, and they really wanted to make an impact in those countries. So they don't fund other people. The Adhara business funds the Adhara Foundation. But if you're looking at a model, and Odette Excel is the name of the woman who set it up about 15 years ago, and she's kind of won every award that's going. She's everywhere. She's amazing in terms of what she's done. So if you want to learn from someone who's been down that road and done it really, really well, she's the role model that you want. So the Adhara Foundation at Adhara Financial Services is the group, the Adhara group.
Great, thanks. Well, we might have time for one last question. So I guess to wrap it up, how do I know if what I'm doing is having an impact?
Measure it. So if I'm trying to provide employment for people with who are long-term unemployed, sometimes we've done snapshots. So how many people am I employing right now in my business? So my target is 20, and I'm sitting at 20. Yay, I'm done. But you have to look at impact over time. And so the question would be, do the people I employ, are they able to stay in employment for 1 year, 2 years, things like that? And are they growing and learning as they do that? If I'm giving money away, I'd be asking my charity partner to give me feedback on whether that's creating any impact. So the way that Thank You does it, as I described, is you can say if I'm buying water products, then I'm looking at water projects. And you could say the same thing to a charity, is I want to focus my investment on this particular area of your work. And so tell me about what's changing in that area thanks to the funding that I'm bringing. So not dollar for dollar, but if your work is with youth homelessness, tell me what's happening with youth homelessness. What are the numbers? Tell me what's going on. Are the numbers going down? Are the numbers going up? Are people staying off the streets for longer? So there's shorter periods of homelessness, shorter periods in mental health institutions as a result of homelessness, those kinds of things. So ask questions about what's happening, measure it, understand how that is being changed, but also understand that it takes time.
Fantastic. Okay, well, we might wrap up then. Thank you very much, Sandy. And thank you for everyone for attending today. So just for everyone that's still online, remember to download the handouts before you exit, and stay in touch with Innovate Queensland via the Grid Group on LinkedIn so you can find out about our future webinars. The GRID program is about helping you with the implementation of innovation in your business. So we will send you a short survey and use your responses to tailor the GRID program to meet your future interests and needs. But otherwise, we'll see everyone on the GRID next time. Thanks again, Sandy.
Thanks, Ellie. Bye.